So should we go person to person to person? Because we
just-
only have 30 minutes.
Yeah, I'll just got a couple, and then you get a couple of you guys.
Yeah, anybody wants to jump in?
Sure.
We go.
Nancy, I read part through your biography, and I think, as somebody, a father with a daughter, I thought it was very interesting, your experience. You were a unique or pioneer, or it was tough because you're a woman. B, you were exceptionally bright.
Yeah.
And C, you were working in a male-dominated area so there was a lot of things that you were doing that were really unique story. And if you could tell, like, what was it like about being so tell, how did you end up working at GE, and what were you doing, and talk a little bit of computers from the point of being like a girl growing up, not experiencing all the obstacles you dealt with.
Oh. Well, I got the job at GE because of the interview. Somebody going around looking for, and this person was looking for female nerds. I mean, there's no question that's what she was looking for.
And why was she looking for female nerds?
Because at that point of the war,
Was this during World War II?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of the men were either in the army or coming back and going back to school.
Okay.
So they weren't available or at the stage of being available for the job. So she's trying to find a few to help fill in. There were plenty of men that were there, I mean, but she rounded up, there were 13 of us. All nerds, all shy, all ridiculous, and put us in a room, and people would come and say, do you know how to do such and such? No, but tell us and we'll do it, because we're all compulsive workers. None of us wants to sit around doing nothing. So if we run out of something to do, we walk up and down, hey, you need any help? Even though we were shy, we wanted to
And
help.
I thought it was interesting because, see, my guess is that you were a computational pool.
Yes.
And they didn't have computers to try to run a problem. So they'd have to they'd go to the girl. And so give an example of what kind of problems would you guys work on?
Well, a lot of the people did what they call drag problems, finding out the resistance of the airplane to airflow at different, or stresses on things. Typical stresses are differential equations. They're not algebra. The drag things usually are fairly simple, algebraic. And then one of the things that I did a lot was the design of gear trains, because a jet engine has an axis down the center, and that axis has to run everything. And not everything wants to run at the speed of the airplane, So they'd have all these gear trains, and oh boy, I lost the word.
Transmission?
No, I'm talking about the ones that go down to a point. That
Funnel? Column?
Concentric?
that meshed in each other at different angles and things. One of the things that I could do was design them. Now, there is no theoretical design for them. It's not a solvable problem. Because if you try to solve them, you turn out with a gear with 57 2/3 teeth. And they can't build that, so you have to design them with something in your gut, creativity. You have to say, well, let's see, you need this and you need this. I think 37 teeth on this one and 14 on the other one would work, and then you could test it and see if it did, but you couldn't solve for it. And it turned out I was good at that. It required an ingenuity, some sort of a gut sense of it, and spherical trigonometry. Fairly complex spherical trigonometry that included the ordinary sine and cosine and that kind of stuff, but also involutes and evolutes of angles, which you don't usually run into at all. And then somewhere along the line, we were getting raises. I was getting them fairly rapidly because I was good at everything. And I reached the top of the raise salary level of that we could make. And this is about the time that they brought in the first computer, and they were hiring people to key punch. So I told my boss I thought I could learn to key punch. He says, of course, but why would you want to? I said, because they make $10 a week more than I do.
Now, Nancy, remind us, what year was this when they can, if you can remember, when they were bringing in that first computer?
Of 1954.
1954. Okay.
And that first computer was the size of 2 refrigerators pushed together. It had a 10-word memory and big, huge panels that looked like an old-fashioned telephone thing with wires and plugs that you plugged in all over the place. So you programmed it by plugging wires all over. And then you fed the data in on punch cards. And then it looked like, you see these old sorters every once in a while on an old movie thing, where cards go through and drop into all these slots.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I was doing was the moment, shear, bending, and that kind of, all that's things you can describe on a cantilever beams. Now cantilever beams are in airplanes a lot of places. They're in the wings, in the body, but that's not usually what you're trying to figure out. But the tail, the compressor blades, the turbine blades, the whole exhaust cone, all those things are cantilevers. Different kinds of cantilevers, but they're different cantilevers. And they are described mathematically by a set of 4 partial differential equations. So we're solving a set of 4 partial differential equations on a computer that has a 10-word memory, which means you could only put a little bit of it in at a time. I could get the whole program on the board, but I'd have to have intermediate data. You know, do such and such, such and such, and then you put the cards back in the top for the next step. So you'd sit there in front of it, pulling cards out of these different slots and putting them back in the card reader. And the solution for one particular cantilever beam under one vibratory condition took about 45 minutes. And it's amazing when you think now that if you ask somebody to do it with less than 250K, they'd say impossible. And we were doing it with 10 words.
So Nancy, you told me a story then. So you were in the computational pool, and this is in the early 50s.
Yeah.
And then you had like a supervisor come in,
Oh yes.
and he created a problem for you guys, and then you quote unquote solved it. So tell us about that.
Okay. We were, as I said, we're all compulsive workers. Although sometimes the people were compulsive at playing war games, little card war games, because that was popular at the time.
War games? Or did you
Yeah,
say
Battleship, things like
Okay,
that.
all right.
You could play on just graph paper.
Okay.
And it did still look like you were working unless somebody looked carefully.
Oh, so you didn't surf the internet? Okay, got it.
Yeah. That and playing bridge by flashlight on lunch hours. Anyway, there's 13 of us, and we were doing, we thought, very well by ourselves. Some guy at GE thought that these 13 girls ought to have a supervisor. So they hire this man. He comes in, and he's going to control the 13 of us. And so he lays out this chart, and people are going to be assigned jobs in order. So there was a couple things I did to upset him on purpose. One of the things I did was ask him if he'd like a tour because he was just new in the building. So I went around the day before I had the tour, and there was a test stand where they could take a jet engine braced to a concrete thing and go from nothing to 7,950 RPM, 3,200 degrees. And the exhaust would come out, really, and go up a chute. It wasn't dangerous, but it sure looked dangerous. So I had him light up that just as we came by. I had everybody do something look dangerous as we walked around the plant. Scared the man shitless. And I had set the whole thing up. And I had a lot of friends in the plant because I was really good at reading blueprints, because I had read them all my life with my father doing the architecture stuff. Reading them in a different situation didn't upset me at all. So these guys trying to build things sometimes were having trouble reading their blueprints. One of the problems was the standard blueprint was taken from aft looking forward. Now sometimes the guys couldn't work from aft looking forward. Sometimes they had to be in front of the engine looking back or on the side. And they couldn't mentally translate their blueprint. So I used to take the blueprints home, weren't supposed to do that, and redraw them from their angle. And so I made a lot of friends because I saved a lot of guys from getting in trouble. So I could set this thing up pretty easily because I had friends all over the place. Another thing they had of the engine as it was being built was on a railroad track within the building. And it would be run from station to station as it was being assembled. And they were kind of used to me coming and crawling in the back of an engine to see something with the flashlight, you know, because I wanted to see what some part really looked like. So I set that up, and that helped a little. But one day I decided I'd had enough with the guy. He would be sued for sexual problems now, but we didn't know about that kind of stuff then. I would see him taking one of the girls and asking them to help him get something out of the supply closet. Now they were spending way too long in the supply closet. And I always avoided the situation, so I never was in the supply cabinet, so I don't know what was in there, but I have a feeling. And I don't like the feeling. And the other thing he'd do, he couldn't talk to any of the girls without putting his arm around them. So he'd go up like it was just being, you know, it made me cringe. So I put my desk in the corner with the slide on the side, my back to the wall, the desk out here and the slide to the side, so he couldn't do that. Because we'd had to reach across the slide to do it. The other thing he did, he smoked these horrible black wet cigars. And he'd leave them on everybody's desk because he was talking to people. So one day I decided to write a letter of complaint to his supervisor. And I wrote the letter with just 7 specific things I objected to. I skipped a whole part I got to go back to, but not right now. And after I wrote it, I thought, well, I don't really know whether the other 12 people agree with this or not. So I put it in an envelope, put a distribution list on it, and I said, check off your name and hand it to one of the others. If you got any suggestions, drop them in the envelope. And if you object, tell me, because I don't want to send something. The letter came back with 12 signatures under mine. The guy lasted another 4 hours. It went in the intercompany mail, and he was gone. But one of the other things that happened, I really had kind of fun doing this. I've got a perverse sense of humor sometimes. He's going to assign jobs in order. Well, the kids who knew how to do drag knew how to do drag studies. The kids who knew, they had things they knew how to do and liked doing. But jobs didn't necessarily come in that order. So one day, one came in for one of the gear trains. And he had assigned me something else because I had just come up. It was something I knew how to do but didn't like particularly, but it was okay. So he tries to assign this, tries to assign this gear thing to the next person in order. And the next person says, but I don't know how to do that. So he goes down to starts down the list. And he goes clear around and he wants to know if I'll take the thing. I said, sure, when I come up. When it comes up my turn, I'll take that. Yeah, I know how to do that one, I'll take that one. And he says, well, when will this do? I said, well, the job you gave me is maybe 6 weeks. He said, but the guy needs to do it tomorrow. I said, yes, but you set out the rules. I didn't, And he says, well, but, you have to do it. And in the meantime, without his or any of the other kids knowing it, I went down to the office of the person who requested it, did it on my lunch hour, and gave it to him. And I said, there's a hooker in this. You got to drive my boss crazy to get me to do it. Because otherwise, the next time you want it quick, you're not going to get it quick. Because, you know, he is not to know that I already did it for you. You're going to bug him. So finally, he comes back around, and the guy comes in and complains again about not getting it done. And I say, well, maybe if you got, you know, I'm assigned to this other project. Maybe if you got the guy I'm doing the other project to sign a little slip saying it's okay if I took some time off to do the other job, maybe then I'd feel it was all right to, you know. It was fun. Another thing we did, there's something called nomographs. And nomographs are a way of graphically solving equations. And I was good at them. So they would be a series of graphs. So for instance, you'd take the upper left one if there's 4 graphs, and it would say the speed of the airplane. And you'd go across to the fuel flow, and down from the fuel flow onto another graph that was maybe air pressure, and then to go across there to the diameter of the turbine, and up to, you know, and eventually you'd come out with the solution to a fairly complicated piece of arithmetic just by drawing lines back and forth on this thing called the nomograph. That was another thing I was good at doing, which is another thing. There isn't any defined way of doing that. It's another thing. It's just somewhere in your brain you have to know what you're doing, because I don't know any way to teach anybody how to do a nomograph. Now, an alignment chart is a simple one, where you take 2 things and put them on a line and draw across to get some intermediate result. That one's easy. But these ones that were 4 different things with, and they wouldn't have a single line on them, they'd have fields of lines, you know.
Yeah.
Well, one boss wanted me to do one to do some, I don't remember to do what. We used to call them General and Admiral's curves, because they impressed people. And so I do this one for him, and was a very complex one. So I made all the lines in different colors. So it was easier to, okay, go across to the green line and down to the red one. So I bring this thing, and it's big, because it's got all these graphs on this one sheet of paper. And he looks at me and he says, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, you take the green." He says, "I didn't tell you I'm colorblind." So that was another just kind of interesting thing that happened.
Let me get Lori. Lori, why don't you? We don't have much time, so Lori, why don't you get your question or two in?
Why don't we go around? I haven't quite figured out how to proceed.
Well, okay.
Grace was going to ask some
Okay,
questions
Grace,
too.
go ahead.
What other kind of jobs did you work at? Like,
Oh, okay.
In your life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, 3 years for aircraft gas turbines, 3 years for Convair in San Diego, doing some kind of similar stuff. 1 year for the National Defense System, Navy Tactical Data System, doing work on their computers that they were going to put on shipboard, designing, programming them. And when I went in there, they were just bare computers. I mean, the hardware was good, but there was no software. So I wrote the initial assemblers, compilers, and all that kind of stuff for that, and then wrote ship-to-ship communication programs. I worked for Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and our big project there was triangulating waves. It was a project on underwater disturbances. It's still going. I talked to the guy not too long ago. It's still useful, still going. They would put recorders, typically 16 fathoms, in different places. Some of them off Hawaii, some of them off Baja Peninsula, off La Jolla. But they had these recorders different places. And they would send water pressure back to La Jolla, to the computer, and then, the waves that have different pressures as they waved along, we would try to triangulate where the wave originated. And the idea was, well, part of it was for the Navy to triangulate to waves set up by depth charges or explosions, things like that. But also is good for tsunamis, underwater earthquakes, underwater volcanic things, shift to the earth crust. And one thing that never occurred to me at first, but I think is interesting, shift in the magnetic North Pole. Because you think it stays still and it doesn't. It has a wobble pattern that has a 17-year more or less repetition. Anyhow, I did that. Then I got divorced and moved back here and worked at Argonne for 19 years. Among the things I did while I was at Argonne, but as a kind of a side, my boss brought me a little newspaper article that was saying the space program was being held up because nobody could solve the differential equations of space travel. And he says, I see a gleam in your eye, you think you can do it. And I said, can I have 3 months to try? So about 2.5 months later, I mailed the solution to NASA, along with the design of the computer that you needed to do it, to solve it. And I had designed the computer for Control Data to make it. But NASA, being stubborn, put it up to the lowest bidder, and it was Sperros. And I don't know whether it was good. I don't think it was as good, but it was apparently good enough. Control Data.
These were early computer companies, Control Data and Burroughs.
Yeah.
Were like IBM
GE.
competitors.
Digital equipment were.
Right.
And then a little bit later, Wang. But
Elaborate on that, Nancy. What was it that you solved?
my program and the computer I designed is on all of the ships. The ones out toward the stars, the ones toward Saturn, the ones going up to the International Space Station, the one going to Mars. All of the ships have my computer program on them. It's a guidance program. You put in some data, and it takes over. And it does the guidance from taking off to Mars or whatever. And it's on all of them. It's on now as a backup system because it was so reliable that they want it on all the planes. It's not very big, and it's so reliable that they've got it on everything. What it was not good at is changing its mind. And now you can still make it to change its mind, but it's not as friendly. Now guys out on these ships decide they don't want to land such and such, but they want to do another orbit and go someplace else. My program was not good at them calling down and saying, hey, I want to change my mind. It didn't do that then. That was about 1962, 63. And one of the other things we did was Northern Illinois disaster planning. We divided Northern Illinois into 2 square mile pieces and up to 32 miles into Wisconsin, 32 miles into Indiana, 32 miles across the Mississippi. And then we took the population of virtually everything within those 2 miles. Water supply, cows, endangered plants, endangered animals, population, roadways, frequency of tornadoes, all the stuff we could feed in. And then I wrote this program. The problem was, now you've got all this data, how do you use it? So I wrote a program that took all of these things, mapped them on a logarithmic scale, and could overlap the logarithms so that if you had a nuclear plant burst or kaput and it spread radiation, you could put wind direction, cows, dairies, orphanages, whatever you needed, onto a single 35 millimeter frame and see where the safe spot was. So you could see what was in danger and where the nearest safe spot was and it was for the whole of northern Illinois. I mean, there might be 50 safe spots, but
Right.
and that was neat. I was glad I didn't have to gather the data. I only had to write the program. But you could do each one separately, or you could overlap them. And because they were all logarithmic, if you play with that sort of thing, they overlap better than the numbers themselves would have. So, and I was really pleased that they considered endangered plants and things like that were important things. But if there's disaster, the first thing you worry about is cows.
Why?
Because disease spreads faster by cow than anything else. Radiation spreads faster. Milk goes into production, goes manufactured really rapidly.
Oh, yeah.
People can hold out for a few days. Cows can't.
Right.
Cows are eating the grass where the stuff's fallen, and they're eating it now, not tomorrow. Particularly dairy cows. The beef cattle, they've got about a week to worry about beef cattle, because there's a delay between them eating the grass and you eating them. But things like Volo, we're in the group thing. You know Volo?
Mm-hmm.